So, welcome to the webinar. What we're going to cover today is the results of a survey we sent out to the industry at the beginning of summer. So, as many of you know, the TSRGD changed in 2016. So we gave it a couple of years and we thought we'd ask the industry how they're coping with it. What are they using? What are they not using? What do they like? What do they not like? I'll cover quite a few things within this, including why did we do the survey in the first place? And before we do that, really, we have to look at why did the TSRGD change? Then we'll show you a bit about who responded. We'll go through some results and just a few slides at the end with further thoughts. A few of the questions were quite subjective, so actually there's some opinion in here. So I will point that out when they're opinion and not necessarily data. Again, just a reminder for those of you that have just joined us, if you missed the first slide there, if you do want to make a comment or ask a question, please use the chat function and ask a member of staff. So why the survey? Why did we do it? As I've just said, the law changed a couple of years ago now, hopefully for the better, maybe not in some people's opinion. And we wanted to figure out how the industry is working with this. How are you coping with it? What changes has it brought to you? What impact has it had to the traffic signing industry? So before we look at the results, let's look a little bit about why the government changed this document. Realistically, it's an old document. Its first edition in this guise. I mean, there have been traffic regulations that going back as far as 1936, as far as I can tell. But realistically, it's been in the previous format before 2016 since 1964. There were major revisions in 1975, 81, 94, which included the now so-called Guildford rules, and in 2002, which is realistically its last incarnation. Most of those changes were actually prescribed new traffic signs. So if you look, for instance, in the 1964 edition, there were 276 signs. By 2002, that had risen to 862. This is for many reasons. But if you think about that, 1964 is a long time ago. I wasn't even born then, amazingly. I know that's hard to believe, those of you that know me. I've had a hard paper round. But the roads were very, very different back in 1964 to they are today. So actually, the whole landscape has changed. I mean, back in 1964, it was the year of flower power, peace and love, and the hippie movement. And this car was the European Car of the Year, amazingly. What a great piece of engineering that was. The Austin 1800, and actually 386,000 of them were produced in 10 years' time. This was the European Car of the Year, English car, great piece of kit in 1964. However, I'm slightly disappointed because in the same year, this is what the Italians were doing. Slightly nicer vehicle, I would imagine. Ferrari 275 GTB was also released in 1964. The roads were different, as we said. There were only 12 million cars on the roads. Now on a Friday night, it feels like there are 12 million on the M25 alone. There was no speed limit. That didn't come into force on a trial basis until 1965. As you can see, back in the 60s, deaths on the roads and reported casualties were at their peak pretty much. Talking of infrastructure, in 1964, the government announced plans to build 3 new towns in the southeast of England, one of those being in the centre of a tiny village called Milton Keynes, which we've all driven around and around and around. Bit more transport related. In 1964, the British and French governments committed to build the Channel Tunnel. It was expected to take 5 years to build. As many of you will know, it finally opened in 1994, slightly longer than expected. Also in 1964, the 4th road bridge was opened. Construction for that began in 1958, so that tells you about choosing where you build your infrastructure and who to partner with, perhaps. Looking at statistics, as we will do a lot of statistics in these slides, to frame this change over the time. In 1964, the inflation rate was 3.5%, and the UK interest rate was 7%. Great for savings, not necessarily for mortgages. However, the weekly wage was just £16, and now it's 509. It's a huge increase. Probably the most shocking statistic of all of those is the average house price. Yep, average house price was £3,360. It's now about £250,000. In fact, in London in 2018, the average property value is £484,000. So everything's changed. So back to TSRGD and what happened. It came into force on the 22nd of April, 2016, and it revoked the previous edition. There was actually an amendment in November 2017 that came into force in December, but that really was designed to correct some of the errors and omissions in the original document. A lot of the stated aims for TSRGD 2016 was to reduce sign clutter. If you look, detailed policy review showed that the traffic signs had doubled in the last 20 years, the amount of traffic signs, which is a significant increase. It wasn't just about reducing clutter, it was also about complexity. I mean, at a certain point, I think 2014, the DFT were running at 600 special authorizations a year. So traffic signs that were not prescribed having to be checked and approved or not approved in some cases. So that kind of frames why and what happened. So let's have a look at who responded so we can understand what kind of people we had responding to the survey. So we had a total of 64 people complete the survey. We had more than that start it but not finish it. So I've excluded those just for clarity of data. That was a 72% completion rate. So those that started it in general finished it. On average, it took about 20 minutes. So it wasn't too onerous on time, I hope. One of the questions we asked, just to kind of frame where we are, is what was the primary job role? So as you can see, the vast majority actually scheme design, quite a few sign designers, small percentage of manufacturers, and 24% of other. And we did ask people to specify just so we could be clear, because we can't put everyone in the same box. We kind of knew that asking the question. Here's a kind of list of those other roles. So as you can see, pretty much people involved in using the TSRGD on a regular basis, which led to the next question realistically, which is how often do you use the TSRGD? Quite an even split between weekly and daily, and not so many people doing it monthly, which is a reasonable split for people using it in their daily lives. How often do you use the traffic signs manual was an equal question alongside that. And as you can see, there's a strong correlation between the two, and I think that would be expected. So looking at the results, and what did people actually say, and what do people think? First question was around terminal signs. The fact that there's no longer a requirement to place 2 terminal signs. It isn't expected that this happens all the time. If you read the circular document that came out from the department, this is really to cater for places where putting 2 signs makes no sense, where perhaps the landscape doesn't allow it, where the second of those signs doesn't inform drivers. Whereas previously, in 2002, you'd have to place them regardless of whether they benefited the drivers, which obviously would contribute to clutter. So we asked a couple of questions on these amendments. The first question was, have you made use of it? Have you found it useful really already within the last 2 years? And reassuringly, 69% of people said yes, they have. Then we asked, do you see a future use for it? In other words, will you continue to, or if you haven't, will you? And the overwhelming majority, 82%, said yes. So this looks like it was a useful amendment. Next, the mandatory links tying upright signs and road markings have been removed. So there is not necessarily a link between a legal link between the line markings and the upright signage. I wasn't sure how this would affect people, so I asked the question again, have you made use of it? And will you use it in the future? And here's the result. 41%, nearly 42% said yes. But another high percentage, 77% of people said they see a future use for it. So again, you'd probably consider that to be a usable amendment if people are planning to use it. Slightly contentious. Dimensions for parking bays have been relaxed, except obviously for those for disabled badge holders. This could, of course, lead to some great fun and games in car parks, like the picture there, courtesy of the Wales News Service. I think I've been in that car park. Luckily, my car isn't a van. So again, the obvious question is, have you made use of it? It's a bit more split, this one. 48% say no, only 33 said yes. But yet again, 74% of people say they see a future use. So people will be using this. So I kind of second guessed this one, and I asked the question, because if you're not using it now, but you do see a future use in it, why are you not using it now? What problems do you possibly see? So I asked the question pretty much based on enforcement. Do you see any issues in enforcing different bay sizes? Quite a high percentage, actually, 66% said no, they don't see a problem. So I've got a few comments that on most of the questions where we asked you for comment, just about everybody that responded commented. I haven't got them all down because otherwise I'd end up with a very, very large slide deck. I've picked a few just to try and give some balance. So most of the issues were seen to be about uniformity. You know, if you have one car park with very small bays and then one with very large bays, you're going to cause some confusion. And some very, very good comments and some consistent comments about SUVs. As SUVs are the largest selling segment in vehicles these days, a small parking bay is not going to be suitable for many, many vehicles. And I've highlighted the bottom line in red because I thought it was a nice, simple comment to make that somebody made, that was trying to maintain consistency in markings across car parking zones, which is a good thing to do. You know, think about consistency, think about drivers. Related to that, you could not just the dimensions, but actually what you make these parking bays of, what they consist of. They no longer have to be lines. They can now be made of different color pavings, different color tarmac, different color surfacing, whatever you choose, they can be done. Now, that obviously asks another question, doesn't it, really? Is what else, you know, how do you go about this? So the first thing we asked was, have you made use of it? And again, high percentages said no, but a huge percentage see a future use for it. But if you're going to do it, then how do you know what to do? What kind of pitfalls would you find? Why have you not done it yet? And I think that's down to a lack of guidance. So I asked that question. Do you see a need for further guidance on this issue? And 64% of people said yes. People want things like that. What kind of contrast is recommended? They've also commented that this should come through the traffic signs manual, which is a very strong comment through quite a lot of the subjects here. Sign illumination. Now, furthering on from the work and amendments after 2002, realistically now, only critical warning signs and regulatory roundels need to be illuminated in a street lit area. So more and more warning signs do not need to be illuminated. The idea here is that reduces some visual clutter, and it can reduce costs. So we asked the question, have you made use of it? 75.8% of people said yes, they have. So clearly a very useful amendment, and a staggeringly high, nearly 92% of people see a future need for this. Interestingly, just one respondent said no for future use. I then asked, do you feel there are cost savings from illumination? And a staggeringly high, 93% of people said yes. I did ask a few people around in the industry what kind of cost savings were to be made, and I think that could be a subject of a future webinar because I'd like to understand that better myself. But I've had some estimates to tell me that the installation cost alone is 33% more expensive for a typical ADS sign. And just if you take a typical traffic sign, if you go back to the governance circular pre TSRGD 2015, they asked the question about costs. And the average yearly cost to illuminate one traffic sign is £13 in energy cost. I'm sure that's changed now because my energy bill's certainly gone up since 2015. I asked a further question on this because it's highlighted even further in standards. And that's the standard involved in traffic signs BS EN 12899 Part 1, says that when placing non-lit warning signs, high performance material should be considered. So I asked the question, because this is of interest to me and my company, of course, and that is, what class of material do you specify for non-lit warning signs? I'm pleased to say many said it varies, because clearly it will and it should. Quite a few, 35% said R2 or RA2, and just 16% said R3B. Whereas the actual standard itself, BSEN 12899 Part 1, does state use high performance material. So realistically, the majority you would expect should be R3B. Just to frame that so you can understand why I say that, I found this in my archives. If you look on the left, you've got a lit class RA2 sign, and on the right you have an unlit R3B sign. So without a luminaire, that sign is plenty bright enough. That is the subject of a webinar we did last year on sign illumination. You should get a link for all of our archives at the end of this. If you've not seen this and seen the data and the results and the science behind it, I'd urge you to watch it, because it's quite illuminating, if you'll pardon that terrible pun. Kind of illumination related. Signs placed within a 20-mile-an-hour limit or zone don't need to be directly illuminated, but must be reflectorized. Slightly different question I asked here, and that is, because this is what I thought the government's aim was would it be easier to implement a 20-mile-an-hour zone? And 61% of people said yes. So yeah, it seems another usable amendment if you're considering 20-mile-an-hour zones. On a slightly different subject, I was surprised to see this in the original drafts, but boundary signs may now incorporate photographic images showing an item of local interest, as you can see there. I thought this was fairly small and specialist. I didn't think many areas would necessarily take up on this, although it's quite a nice idea. It certainly gives you some unique identity and some wayfinding marks that you can follow. So I asked the question, have you made a use of this amendment? And as kind of expected, 16% said yes, so a fairly small number. I wouldn't imagine everywhere, or it would not even apply to everybody on the line. But seeing a future use for it was a reasonably high 37%. So that means that certainly areas that couldn't do it before, or had to do it as a special authorization before, which is how it was up until 2016, have now considered the use of it. On a similar vein, but a lot more specialized, I guess, this sign is, it certainly would not apply to many people responding. And that is, there's little swatches and logos on motorway service areas. They were previously special authorizations. Now they are allowed without authorization, as long as they are within the guidelines within the document. So the same question arises, have you made use of it? And as you can see, 50% say no and 40% say NA, so not applicable. Same with the future use is fairly similar, with a very high percentage of not applicable. So I looked at that and thought, okay, well, that means the not applicables are really skewing the data, because clearly it can't apply to everyone. So if we just look at people it does apply to, remove the NA, then we've got a bit more of a similar pattern to some of the others. So yes, a small percentage say they have already, and 40% say this of those that they apply to say that there's a future use. So yes, it was useful, but obviously to a lot smaller percentage of the industry. This one does apply to illumination, but I kept it separate because it is a subject all of its own, I think, for some people. And that is the requirement to light the sign faces on a self-writing bollard has now been removed within a street lit area. These signs must be reflectorized, as they always have been. So the first question, have you made use of it? And a very high 75, nearly 76% of people say yes, they've made use of it. And a staggeringly high, again, 87% of people said they see a future use. Only 2 respondents, by the way, that no is just 2 respondents, said they don't see a future need. I then asked the question out of curiosity, have you placed more self-writing bollards as a result of this change? because the change was there to possibly to help decrease costs. But if it's changed behaviours, that may be good and it may be bad. Who knows? But it's quite an even split, as you can see, 40.3 versus nearly 42%. Sign indicating prohibition of stopping near school entrances may now be placed without a traffic order. There were a few other markings that can be placed without a traffic order, but I focused on this one particularly because when I first did some in the field webinars back in 2016, this got quite a lot of conversation about enforceability. So I thought I'd put this one in and spread it out to get more feedback. And there we go. So have you made use of it? No, is the bigger number there, 48%. But again, as is with almost everyone so far, do you see a future use? Yeah, 62.9%. So most people can see a use for it, maybe not have done it yet. If anyone's got a particular reason why they feel that some of these they haven't done, but they want to, if there's a reason for that can help me understand it, that would be great if you could message me, email me, or send it in the chat function, because I'd like to understand that better. But clearly, as I said to you, when I first talking to people about this, that most of the comments were about enforceability. So I asked the question, do you see a problem with enforceability of this? Or do you see any issues? And I got some very good feedback, and I learned a few things that I didn't know. Certainly about enforcement. Clearly, it's not my necessary area of expertise, so it's always good to learn. The comment in the middle there, I'll highlight there. It says, placing sign without a TRO would enable the police to enforce it. However, it would not be enforced by civil enforcement officers. Quite interesting one. And again, I think the bottom comment kind of echoes that. We understand is not correct and an order is still required, confirmed by regional traffic user groups. The top one was quite a nice, at least a positive comment, that most of these markings are generally acknowledged by motorists. They do understand them with or without the sign. So, and I think you'll find, I did have one comment somewhere that said, it doesn't matter if you put a sign or a line there, those kind of people that will stop on those markings will stop there whether it's illegal or not, which is a bit sad, but I guess true. Further to markings, box junctions, size and shape has been pretty much relaxed. There are still a couple of restrictions, but it's now a lot more flexible. It does make a lot of sense because the roadway doesn't always match as the book previously was. So again, the usual question, have you made use? 58% said no. So a reasonably high percentage said no this time, but 73% just about said they see a future use. So I guess this is dependent on schemes. If you've got no junction yet to work on, or you can think of a junction where you might want to put this in the future, then you can see it being useful. If you've got any other views on that, please, as again, send it into the chat function. Great. Last one on markings. I did allude to this on one of the questions on 20-mile-an-hour zones, which I've omitted down to a typo. Those of you that responded will know all about the typo. Road marking 1065 can now be used as a repeater, which is an interesting idea. So I guess the drive there is that it removes the need for upright signage, which could be deemed as clutter. You can see a use for it if you've got an area of outstanding natural beauty, you've got some parks or somewhere that you want the traffic goes through that you don't want to put up signage and repeater signs, you can legally use a roundel painted on the road. But that does beg the question that I asked next, and that was, firstly, did you use it? 66% of people said no, but again, a 67.7 said yes, they see a future need. So people are thinking about it, but then I did ask, why not now? Why would you not do it? Possibly because of maintenance implications. So I asked that question. Pretty much all the comments that I got in for this were regarding maintenance, but the bottom comment I think is probably the most simple and eloquent there. It's the same as any marking. It really does need to be kept on top of. The difference with a roundel, I guess, is if it's not there, then it can't be enforced. If it's worn out and it can't be seen, then the driver can argue a loophole and potentially say, no, I didn't see the marking. I don't know what the speed limit was. This one is one of my favorite pet hates. So temporary signs, those and of this ilk, new roundabout ahead, new road layout, all of those kind of signs now have to have a remove by date affixed to the back of them, a sticker that tells you when it needs to be removed by, which is an interesting concept. And certainly there wasn't any guidance on how and what and how you should do that. I asked the question about that in a second, but there were comments about the actual validity of these signs, which I thoroughly concur with, and that is, you do see these on road layouts that are completely pointless. If you are new to the area and you've never seen the junction or the layout, then it's always new. If you live there, it's only new the first time you use it, realistically. So you've got to question the need for these. And here were some of the comments. I asked, how has it affected you, rather than would you use it? So there's some positive ones in there, only in a good way. Clear reminder of when they should be removed. Setting dates in the removal in the diary. And I love the bottom one. I highlighted it just because it did make me chuckle a little bit. Finding loads of these signs that have been left in place, one for over 20 years. That's well past temporary. Then I asked, have you got a system in place to record the remove by date? And a staggeringly high 51% of people said no, which I was surprised at. But then again, it would depend on who the onus falls on to remove the sign. I guess there would be people on the response that say, actually, they pass that responsibility to the contractor, and so on. I'd like to understand a bit more about that. So now we move on in a second to a bit more subjective. So at the end, we asked a few questions asking people how they felt and how they used it and those kinds of things. And we started with this one. Has the introduction of TSRGD 2016 increased or decreased the level of sign and road marking related queries? Use the word queries to keep it fairly vague. It just really, the feeling was, is it causing you problems? Is it giving you more questions to answer that you didn't before? And it's fairly evenly split. So there was some increase for 37, no change for 46%, a big increase for 14%. So I guess that probably splits down a bit by job and function. But only one respondent claimed a big decrease, which is interesting. No one else, just one. Around half claims some form of increase. So it has affected, not necessarily positively. Do you prefer the old TSRGD 2002 or the new TSRGD 2016? Fairly high percentage, I think you'll agree. 84% said they prefer the old, and 16% said they prefer the new, which I thought was interesting. And I thought I'd have a look and split the data a different way. So then I looked at it, and bearing in mind we asked people how often they refer to it, and we asked people what they did, I sliced the data that way. So what we get now is, of all respondents, as you know, as we just said, it's nearly 84% said prefer the old. But those who only use it monthly, the least frequently, 42%, nearly 43%, actually prefer the new. Maybe there's some correlation between how often you refer to the document and how experienced you are, perhaps. I didn't ask how many years experience of using TSRGD. That might have been a useful slide to do. And if you look at it by job, looking at purely sign designers, those that it's really affected by, only 7% said they prefer the new. So there is a real split between how people use the document, how often they do, and what their actual role is as to how much they prefer the old over the new. Now we did talk about navigation of the TSRGD 2016. As many of you will know, hopefully all of you on the line will know, the format changed drastically into this little pick and mix approach, which I think, bearing in mind how many special authorizations were around parking time plates, was there to suit the ever-changing need of a parking time plate. Doesn't necessarily suit normal signage, certainly regulatory and warning signs, but it did change the whole format of the book. So we now have this strange tabulature approach where you can pick and mix a piece of text, a shape and a symbol, and so on. So looking at how we describe navigation, 46% said difficult, or very, difficult. 35 said difficult, 46 said very difficult. And only people that use it daily find it easy. Which, again, like any new document, if you think about change, maybe in another 2 years' time or 3 years' time, that percentage will go up. How do you find the terminology in TSRGD? Now, this one is a fairly reasonable split. 38% said okay, but 40% said difficult. But only 6.4 said easy, which is a strange one. No one who used it monthly found it easy or very easy. So again, that kind of indicates to me those that use it monthly are not, if they're not familiar with the language anyway, perhaps this is more about experience than it is about anything else. If you then split it again into job role, sign designers, 57% said difficult, 14 said very difficult, and 28% said okay. And they actually, sign designers find it the most difficult, and they all use it daily or weekly. There is not one sign designer that responded that refers to the TSRGD monthly. Do you still refer to the old TSRGD for sign images and reference? A staggeringly high 88.7% said yes, which is not surprising when we look at some of the comments a little later. 9%, nearly 10% said no. So again, perhaps they are newer users and are familiar more with the new format than the old. I'm somewhere in between all of this. I came into this industry when CE marking first came in, and I was given the onerous task of understanding the differences between TSRGD 2002 and 2016. It was actually 2015 draft I first looked at. So I'm reasonably familiar with both now, but I don't use them every day. Now, has that loss of diagram numbers affected your asset management system? If so, how? This is a free text field, actually. We've got quite a few comments here. I've tried to keep it balanced and highlighted just a few rather than all of them. First comments, no, there's still cross-reference to TSRGD 2002. Not that I'm aware of, no. And we did have a couple of yeses. Yes, you can't find the sign now, they're in numeric order. And the last one, yes, affected everything we do, bring them back. So there's a few of those, a few emotive comments. Has the flexibility in TSRGD created any problems? If so, things like confusion, inconsistency, legal challenges. This is really getting to understand what people do. It's difficult to put all the responses here. We had a lot of responses, just about everybody commented. I've highlighted a few. So the top one, I'll let you read it for yourselves, perhaps. But there's a certainly thing there. The bottom comment on that top one, I'm often told it's in the reg, so it's okay. Well, it isn't okay, and redesigns are required, but this creates conflicts that were not there when we had the 2002 regs. So yeah, the long and short of that, for those of you that know it will understand it, and that is, previously with such a prescriptive document, you really had to do what the document said. Well, whereas you have flexibility, you can design things differently, and differently can mean wrong if you don't use your judgment correctly. Yeah, and yes, some confusion and inconsistency, but no legal challenges yet, was one of the comments. Further on to that, because I pointed this out on one of my webinars, talk about consistency. The one on the left, diagram 642.2a, is the correct layout according to the traffic signs manual for that diagram. The image on the right is perfectly allowable under TSRGD 2016. Doesn't necessarily make any sense to a driver. It doesn't feel right, but it's perfectly allowable. And that's what I meant by confusion and inconsistency. And the bottom comment there came from someone that said, I've reviewed many odd looking direction signs since TSRGD 2016 was brought in. I've seen a few before that as well, to be fair, but this was a killer question for me. Do you feel TSRGD has delivered the flexibility it was intended to? And actually the majority, only just, but 56%, said no, they didn't. Which I find quite interesting if you consider that actually the vast majority of people have been using the amendments and the absolute majority see a future use. So actually there is some flexibility. I guess it's just the way it's laid out has caused a problem, which we'll come to. If you could change one thing in the TSRGD 2016, what would you do? I've highlighted this because it's such a very, very well thought out answers here. And then I've got a few little snippets I've put in because I did like some of this here. Main issue is the lack of guidance. We're 2 years on and we still don't have the guidance. And the bottom one there, we're in a development is king era. Let's go for the next. So a couple of suggestions came in actually. I quite like the top one there, a hot linked online version that brings back all of the relevant text that's scattered through the document relating to a particular sign in one place. And of course, being free, yes. I think that's a great idea. I think that's really, there's a couple more comments on that. I haven't put them all out, but there were several comments about making it a hot linked PDF where you could actually click on your sign, click through to the relevant things, and it just would make it easier to navigate. Quite an interesting comment. I talked about experience on the left there. You can see, go back to 2002. I think it was easier, but that's probably because I'm old, which is a telling sign of our industry, I guess, to a degree. People have been used to the old document, and it is a change. Yeah, it would be easy to read if it was laid out in a way that requires less clicking between things. The interesting thing about that is if any of you saw the 2015 draft, before it morphed into the final published 2016, there was less flicking between things. It was much more of the tablature approach. What we ended up was something between the 2002 and the current 2016. So it's they started trying to make it like that, but it just didn't work. A few more. Format and diagram numbers, orientation of pages. That comment on orientation came up many, many times. I didn't give you a percentage, but trust me, there's a lot of it. Turn it around 90 degrees, put layout portrait, not landscape, because part of it's portrait and part of it's landscape, which is not very nice, particularly if you need to print it out. And it also makes PDFs quite difficult. You can rotate a PDF, but it just makes it a bit awkward. Top one, bigger pictures. Have a list of diagram numbers and pictures in number order. One thing I would point out about diagram numbers, although they are not all there as they were in 2002, in the circular that came out with TSRGD 2016, there is a document at the back that lists all of the diagram numbers and references them to their section within 2016. It is a useful thing to do. If you haven't seen it, that's where it exists. And the bottom right one, I think a little tongue-in-cheek, but I'll say it and start again. The bottom comment I highlighted because it was very succinct and nicely put. It says, while the flexibility has been achieved to some degree, more clarification and guidance for certain aspects would be useful, particularly for people who don't carry out sign designs regularly. And I think the data supports that observation really well. So a little bit of a summary and some further thoughts. We're almost through. I figured we'd be slightly ahead of time here. So a couple of comments from me regarding lighting firstly. 2016 TSRGD removes the requirement to light many signs legally. It does not, however, remove the need for signs to serve the road user. So just taking away a luminaire does not necessarily serve the road user. You need to consider using the correct grade of material, and in some instances, you still may need to light a sign. As I said before, do check out our webinar on sign illumination if you want more science on that. There does appear to be a correlation between the usage of the TSRGD and how well users have adapted to the new format. Bearing in mind, this is a big change and it's a big document. And the bottom one, I've already mentioned it, but despite the majority of people saying the TSRGD 2016 didn't give the intended flexibility, most respondents say they see a future use for all the amendments in this survey. So it realistically has given some flexibility. Otherwise, they wouldn't have said yes, one would imagine. And the last slide, pretty much. The new format, in particular, the orientation of the document generated a lot of comments. I certainly felt that when I was doing my research a couple of years ago, and I feel that one. Those great comments around an online hyperlinked version. I'm sure there'll be somebody out there thinking they can monetize that by creating a nice little app for it, perhaps. But it's a great idea, and I really like it. And I'm going to go up and see the DFT with these results in the very near future, and I'm going to strongly have a conversation about this, because I'm sure they'd be interested in improvements, and I'm sure they'd be interested to know what the industry feels. They've already told me they want to talk to me about this, so it would be great to give them some positive feedback about what else we could do to make it better. The lack of diagram numbers is a strong concern. It always has been. It was when I did my original series of seminars and webinars. And the traffic signs manuals are very long awaited, but they will give that reassurance. They will help people to make these decisions. I would caveat that pretty much everything you can do under the TSRGD 2016, you can still do as per the 2002 regs. If you follow the guidance in the existing, slightly outdated TSMs, they will still get you a legal result. It is pretty much backwards compatible. So if you're afraid of making a change, you don't have to make the change. It should give you the flexibility to make changes that you couldn't have done before. So that is the results of our survey. Thank you for dialing in, everybody. I'm going to have a look and see if we've got any comments or questions. Whilst I do that for a minute or so, those of you that are dialed in regularly know that we do this annually. We pick some subjects, but we always ask the audience. We ask you as an industry what you'd like us to talk about. So if you've got any suggestions as to what you'd like to see a webinar on next year, please do let us know either by email or right now within the chat field, and we'll filter them through. And by early next year, we'll have a plan for a series of webinars next year, if you so wish. So let me have a look at the questions and see what we've got, and I'll see what I can answer. Comment. We've got mainly comments. Interesting comment there. It may be interesting to find out if a future Scottish version improves this any. A comment about CPZ zones, often too large without repeater signs catching drivers out. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so there was an interesting comment. There is a website that exists, tsrgd.co.uk, with all of the hyperlinks for a small fee, which they haven't paid me clearly. So there is a website. Somebody has already done that. Someone has done the work. I will check that out myself. Yeah. Somebody else made a useful comment here saying using the find function in PDF versions does help navigation, i.e. input diagram number. Thanks for that. That's quite useful for those that don't do it. Brilliant. Interesting. There's a very useful comment. Thank you for this one as well. Someone said, no, we have recently had an adjudicator ruling stating that replacing markings with different colored materials is not permitted for red routes. Okay, excellent. Right, okay, that's pretty much all we've got time for. So thank you very much for dialing and attending, and thank you for those of you on the line that took part. It has been very useful for me to see this and very helpful for me to understand how the industry works and what your pain points are. As I said, I will be going to the Department for Transport to share the results and to talk through this in the very near future. And I will try and put forward some of the helpful suggestions that you've come up with. And do let us know what you'd like to talk about next year. And hopefully we'll see you at a lunchtime sometime in Q1 2019. Thanks.